Hi everybody, and welcome back to the final edition of our studies throughout the month of July on migration stories in the book of Genesis. Now, because we've only spent 5 weekends and 5 weeks on this study, we're really having to jump and leap from passage to passage. And unlike last week, this week we are indeed going to have our last Wednesday discussion here in the Bonhoeffer room at St. Mark, as well as on Zoom, and then of course we'll capture that online for those that can't be present during that time. So welcome back, and this will be the final edition of this study. Then we'll take a break, and after I go on a mission trip in September, we'll pick up a study after that. So this is what we've done throughout the month. These are the texts that we've looked at. And the thing I want you to notice the most is that not all migration stories are the same. There's no cookie cutter about migration stories. The first story of migration began with God's call, and the second then was initiated by a famine. The third had to do with people having too much money, not deprivation. Last week, we saw a story of migration of Hagar being sent away as part of this ongoing trend of oppression of women, misogyny, and so forth. And today we're going to see what is one of the most common sources of migration, and that is violence. Whether it's actual violence or the threat of violence, that tends to be one of the more common sources of migration, and particularly mass migration from the 20th century on. So we've got a lot to cover here, and we're just going to be looking at the last part of Genesis 27, verse by verse, but there's a lot of backstory there, because our reading for this week begins with the phrase, Esau hated Jacob. So there's something there. Now, Esau hated Jacob, it says, because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And so this is Isaac. And so let's go back a little bit and just kind of see how we get to this point where Esau now hates Jacob. That's in the very first half of verse 41. Back in Genesis 24, Abraham had sent one of his servants to find a wife for Isaac back among his people. So he went back up to the land of Haran and went to the home of Nahor, one of Abraham's surviving brother, and went there to find a wife that was fitting for Isaac. So a couple of curious things happen here. And the first is that when the servant arrives, he prays for God to show him the right woman for Isaac. That may not seem uncommon to us. We pray about things a lot. But this is a development, a religious development in the story of Abraham and his people. You remember how when Abraham was encamped between Bethel and Ai, he called on the name of the Lord. That's the way the phrase was used, and it's been repeated. So that means it's a significant act that Abraham is doing, calling on the name of the Lord. Well, now we're starting to see others do that, and within this story of Isaac and Jacob and so forth, we're going to find now that a servant calls on the name of the Lord and prays. We'll see in a moment a woman calls on the name of the Lord and prays, and people other than Abraham calling on the name of the Lord and praying. So this is a kind of the continual development of a certain way of piety, of people talking to God who are not named Abraham. Whereas before, God called Abraham, God called Abraham, God called Abraham, God called Abraham, and then Abraham calls on the name of the Lord. So now we're starting to see a bit of a sea change in the way that piety gets played out in these stories. So the servant prays and God sends Rebekah. It's a lovely story in chapter 24. You might want to read sometime. And then Rebekah comes back with the servant to where Abraham and his family are. And she meets Isaac. They are in love and they get married. But another recurring theme happens here, and that is Rebekah is barren. Just like Sarah was barren, and just like Rachel later, Jacob's beloved wife, is going to be barren. Barrenness is a real issue here, and it's a theological issue, not simply a marital one, because God has promised family through these people. And here they are, their spouses, their wives, more or less, are not able to produce children. And we saw how with Abraham and Sarah, that drama gets played out. And then there's Hagar, and then there's Ishmael, and then there's Sarah, age 90, having a baby. Now Isaac marries, and behold, Rebekah is barren. So once again, Isaac prays for Rebekah. And God opens her womb, and she conceives. But it's a difficult pregnancy because she has twins. And within her, these twins are struggling. So what we're going to see is that the twins are both children, they're maternal twins. They're both children being born at the same time, and they're representative, they're types. So Rebekah then prays to God about her pain in childbirth, And if it's like this, these children struggling within her, why does she need to have babies? It's just a terrible situation to be in. And she cries out to the Lord for an answer. And in chapter 25, verse 23, God says to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. One shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. Okay, so this is a prophecy of a sort. It's referring to Jacob and Esau. Esau will be born first. Esau will be the stronger in many ways. But in the end, Jacob will be the one that's elected to be the father of the nation of promise, and not Esau. So the struggle that Rebekah is experiencing in her womb is actually a type for the struggle between these 2 peoples and these 2 nations. So now they're born, and it's an interesting birth story. Just go back and read it in Genesis 25. Esau grows up, and he's a hairy man. He's a manly man. He's an outdoors man, He's an ancient Near East jock. And he's his father's favorite. Isaac just loves Esau. Partly because Esau is so good at going hunting and bringing back game that they cook, and Isaac likes that. Jacob is described as a man who stays in the tents, a quiet man, and he knows how to cook, and Esau knows how to cook also, but Jacob kind of excels in it, and the language almost sounds like he's a bit effeminate. I don't know if that's actually true or just a little bit of a preference. More than that, even, it's a type. We often have this when there are 2 brothers who are born. One's described in one way and one's described in the other. And that started with Cain and Abel, right? Cain was a herder and Abel grew crops. And they kind of were played out as types of the herding communities and the settled agricultural communities and the many struggles that those communities often have over land and water and things like that. So you've got these 2 twins, they're born, they're very, very different, and along the way 2 very significant things happen which help to fulfill God's prophecy that the elder will serve the younger. And the first is in Genesis 25. Esau gives Jacob his birthright. Now, in that story, the birthright sounds like a huge thing. It's kind of hard to tell reading throughout the rest of the scriptures where birthright in and of itself is really that notorious of a thing. It's mentioned later in the book of Genesis that when Joseph is in Egypt and his brothers come to eat there, Joseph eats separately from them because Egyptians don't eat with Israelites. That to them was a taboo. And his brothers are there, and they bring food from his table to his brothers. And the brothers are sitting in order of birthright, from the eldest to the youngest. And what shocks the servants there is that when they take the food from Joseph's table to the brothers, they give the youngest brother, Benjamin, 5 times as much food as they do the rest of the brothers. That's a real subversion. So one of the themes going on here throughout the book of Genesis is the inversion of the order, where the elder serves the younger. We've already seen it with Ishmael and Isaac, right? Ishmael's actually the firstborn. Isaac is going to inherit the whole wad from Abraham. Ishmael will be fine. God will take care of him. God has a covenant with him. He's not left destitute, at least in the long run. In the short run, he's deprived. And the younger son, Isaac, is preferred. In the case of the twins here, the youngest will have a way of getting the edge on the oldest. And the first time that happens, it's really Esau's fault. So Esau has been out hunting, and he comes back, and he's famished, he says. And Jacob happens to be cooking stew. Esau knows how to cook. They'll make reference to that later. But he comes in and he asks Jacob, give me some stew, I'm famished. And Jacob says, I'll give you this food for your birthright. And Esau says, what good is a birthright to me? I'm on the verge of starving. Sure, you can have it. Give me my food. Okay. This is not remembered well for Esau in the book of Hebrews. Listen to this. It says, see to it that no one becomes like Esau, an immoral and godless person who sold his birthright for a single meal. So Esau kind of becomes the iconic person who's willing to mortgage important things in the future for satisfaction immediately. And that happens, and Jacob then gets the birthright. We're not really told what advantage that gives him. It apparently gives him a lot of advantage, but it's not really spelled out for us. But the second incident is not on Esau, it's on Jacob, and it's on Rebekah. So at the beginning of our chapter 27, it says that Isaac is old, and sounds like he's going to die any moment now. And he's mostly blind. That's a necessary part of the story for this story to work. And he wants to bless his sons. And remember, Esau is Isaac's favorite. So he asked Esau to go out, go hunting, get some game, come in and cook some of the great stew that Esau has been known to make, that Isaac loves so much, and then Isaac will give him his blessing. And, that we are essentially nominalists, to where we think words are just sounds that we make that refer to things but don't carry any power in themselves. The biblical communities are not nominalists. If you curse somebody, they are cursed. And if you bless somebody, they are blessed. We can talk about that. I think that's a moment of wisdom that we have lost in our culture. But this whole thing of the father giving a blessing to the children, this is a big, big deal. It's going to happen later with Jacob when he blesses his 12 sons. So Esau goes out hunting. Rebekah finds out about that, and she connives with Jacob to fool Isaac into giving Jacob his blessing. And it's hard to do because Esau is a hairy man. Jacob is a smooth man. Esau has his own distinct voice. Jacob's voice is different. Esau smells like a man who goes hunting, and Jacob does not. And so Jacob and his mother, Rebekah, have to pull a fast one on this old and blind, half-blind, mostly blind Isaac. And the way they do that is the mom goes out and starts to cook a couple of young kids and spice them in the way that Isaac really likes, so that they can fool him into thinking this is game that has just been caught and cooked. So she's taking care of that part. Jacob has given her a couple of lambs and she's going for it. In the meanwhile, Jacob has taken some of the lamb skin and put them on his arms and apparently around his neck, so that if his father reaches up to touch him, he'll feel that hairiness, and it'll feel like Esau rather than smooth Jacob. I had a blind uncle, and he was always, whenever we would see him once a year, would say, "Come here, let me feel of you." And he'd touch our shoulders, and he'd touch the top of our heads, and "Oh, my goodness, you're getting so big," that kind of thing. So this is real connivance. They are taking advantage of someone who's been introduced to us as on his deathbed and mostly blind. And so you can go back to the first part of this chapter and read that. So Jacob thinks, or Isaac thinks, that Jacob is Esau, and he utters a blessing on him. And as I said, for us, it's like, yeah, whatever. He just said words. But when you live in a time when words are real, then Jacob is in fact being blessed with the blessing that really belongs to Esau. So he's not only taken his birthright, which is really on Esau for being so impetuous, but now he's taken the blessing, which was a result of connivance between Jacob and his mother. Let's notice here that there's a family trait that Rebekah has brought into the family. And we're going to see it in Jacob, whose name means heel grabber, which seems to be a phrase that speaks to someone who will pull a fast one on you. It's true of Rebekah. She connives. It's true of Rebekah's brother, Laban, who will come into the stories later. He also is a conniving little hound, and he'll do his trick. When Jacob thinks he's marrying Rachel, the woman with whom he falls in love, he in fact gets Leah. And then Laban says, "Well, I can't let my younger daughter get married without the older daughter being married first. That would be a shame." So Jacob ends up marrying both Leah and Rachel. So that family, Laban, Rebekah, and Jacob, they're just sneaky, and in the worst sense of the term. So where are we now? We get to the phrase Esau hated Jacob, partly because Jacob has his birthright and has really, through deception, taken his blessing. And Isaac will say a blessing over Esau, but he can't give him the wad like he did with Jacob. He can only partially bless him. And that's a problem. So Esau hates Jacob, and in the second half of that first verse, Esau says to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching, then I will kill my brother Jacob. Okay? So the second half of the first verse of our reading is very important as well, And this is Esau saying something to himself. Now, let's prod this for a minute, though. He says, the days of mourning for my father are approaching. It is true, at the beginning of this chapter 27, it seemed like Isaac is on his deathbed. He's described as old, mostly blind, and relatively clueless, right? I mean, just doesn't seem to have it all together. And at the beginning of the chapter, he says, these are Isaac's words, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. The thing is, he's not going to die for at least got to be another 30 years. I mean, that's a long time to be laying on your deathbed, blind and addled, and, everybody anticipating your mourning. And the reason I say that is because Jacob's going to run away. Jacob's going to work for 7 years in order to win his wife he wants. Then he gets deceived. He's going to work for another 17 years. That's 14 years that he's gone. Some of the children that he starts to have with his wives, Leah and Rachel, and then he takes on 2 concubines and has children with them. Some of those children are grown up by the time Isaac dies, because there's a story about how they go and fight this battle once their sister has been raped. They go to the village where the guy lives that raped her, and they kill everybody there. I mean, all this time Isaac is laying in dead while these people are getting married and then having children, and children are growing up and becoming warriors, and they have children, and the whole family's just a mess. But it's going to be another 30 years before Isaac dies. So what do we have? We have the familiar kind of thing that these storytellers are not bound to time in the way that we might want them to be, especially if they were historians. Isaac's not on his deathbed. He's going to live for quite some time before he finally dies. And that's going to happen chapter 37. But it's an interesting thing that Esau is going to wait till the days of mourning before he kills Jacob. And there is something about these stories that I find somewhat endearing, and that is when the mother or the father dies, the children, who are often rivals in some way or another, come together to bury the parents. And it happens when Abraham dies. Ishmael and Isaac together bury Abraham where they had buried Sarah. When Isaac dies, Jacob and Esau will bury him. And then there's the death of Joseph and his time for being buried. So on Wednesday, I want to spend a little time looking at Joseph's death and burial. This is at the end of the book of Genesis. Just so we can get a sense that these are significant time markers, and they're treated with incredible amounts of honor, part of which is that rivalries are set aside until the mourning is done. And once the period of mourning is over, then those rivalries may well come roaring back. And so Esau says, he hates Jacob and he plans to kill him, and knowing that the days of mourning are approaching. So we'll look at that a little bit more on Wednesday, and particularly looking at Joseph's death and the way that they bury one another. But here we are in our story. Esau hates Jacob, plans to kill him once Isaac dies. He probably has no idea Isaac's going to be hanging on for another 30 years. And in some respects, Esau's comment was, or at least the way it's described, he said to himself, so he kind of consoling himself, that as soon as the mourning period is over, he gets to act on his hatred toward his brother. But somehow, somehow somebody knew that Esau planned to kill Jacob because they told Rebekah. And so perhaps he said it to himself, but he might have said it out loud, or he might have disclosed it to his servants, or he might have just screamed it out to the wilderness. Somebody heard about it, knew about it, and told Rebekah. So Rebekah, remember, she favors Jacob. She calls Jacob to her and tells him to leave at once. Go away. And she sends him to her brother Laban. Laban still lives up in Haran, and so that's kind of going back to where the story all started. And she sends him up there to first of all, to save his life, but also to get a wife. So for the saving his life part, she hopes to wait it out until Esau's anger is mollified. Okay, so she wants him to leave now, and then when the situation calms down, she'd like for him to come back. But for now, he's got to go. And that's a really interesting thing. On Wednesday, again, we're going to look at something I mentioned in last week's mailing that I sent out on Fridays, my Friday Extra. It's a book entitled The Parable of the Tribes by Andrew Bart Schmuckler. And I want to read the parable for you so that you can see part of the dynamic of what's going on in this story, because it's very familiar to migration stories. Typically when someone migrates because of danger or the perception of danger, the notion is, I'll be back. I'm leaving now, but this dangerous moment is a moment. It's not a ongoing condition. And the hope is to come back. I can't tell you how many families I know in El Salvador who, when the gang violence started there, really wanted to send their sons and daughters, for their sake, elsewhere until it went away. Sometimes that was the U.S., sometimes it was just another country, a contiguous country. And they wanted to send them there until the gang violence went away, which is one reason why in El Salvador, the president there has broken the Constitution in a number of ways in order to stamp out the gang violence, and by and large has been supported by a majority of the people, not because his act is particularly just or even a lovely act, but because that gang violence was a real threat to many of them and was the reason why many of them sent people away. So this whole migration because of violence, typically someone is sent to a nearby country, and typically the notion is that it's for a time, not forever. So Rachel wants Jacob to flee in hopes that Esau's anger will eventually subside. What's interesting is a couple of things. One, Rebekah says, perhaps he will forgive you for what you have done to him. That's the incident of tricking him with the blessing. Why didn't Rebekah say, for what we have done to him? Because she was a big part of that scheme, but she didn't. And Esau seemed angry at Jacob, not necessarily at Rebekah. If you read ahead in chapter 33, this is when Jacob, in fact, returns from Haran back to where his people are here, to where Isaac is, and he meets Esau. And you ought to go there, chapter 33, and just read that. Jacob is expecting the worst. So again, this is either, there's little distinction between violence and the threat of violence. The threat of violence, if you wait to see if it's going to be realized, then it may be too late. So Jacob is preparing himself for the worst, and Esau actually comes across as a really, really decent guy. Read the chapter and tell me on Wednesday what you think about Esau. the plan is for Jacob to go to Haran, stay there until Esau's anger has abated, and then Rebekah ends with a curious phrase, "Why should I lose both of you?" I'm not entirely sure if she means Isaac and Jacob, that Isaac dies, Esau kills Jacob, she's lost both of them, or if Esau kills Jacob, perhaps there's some kind of system of justice where Esau has to be killed and she would lose both of her children. It's not real clear to me exactly what she means by this, but it is a haunting thing, because again, we have a mother who, because of the threat of violence, has to make a very, very difficult decision. And so she's going to lose Jacob to another country, at least for a time, rather than to see him killed and to lose all around. It's powerful. I don't exactly know what it means, but I can feel the depth of Rebekah's anxiety in this part of the story. And then in the last verse of our reading, Rebekah goes to Isaac. And again, she's pulling a fast one on him. She's somewhat deceitful because she doesn't say anything about Jacob and Esau's rivalry, and that's why we need to send Jacob away. She's not going to play that card, but instead she says to Isaac, "I'm weary of my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women such as these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me?" When she says such as these, I think she might be pointing toward Esau's wives, because Esau has married 2 Hittite women already. And in an earlier chapter, when he does that, it says they made life really difficult for Isaac and Rebekah. So instead of going to Isaac and saying, "We need to get Jacob out of here, Esau's angry and might kill him," she said, "Oh, I can't let Jacob marry one of these women. I'm weary of my life because of the Hittite women such as these." She's already got 2 Hittite daughters-in-law. They are part of her family, and yet she doesn't want any more of that. And what I think we have here is the double whammy of the migrant experience. And part of that is the migrant experience of she's trying to get Isaac's support to send Jacob away because she fears for Jacob's life. That's one reality of the migrant experience. Another reality of the migrant experience is they are living as aliens in now their land. They're surrounded by these Hittite women. We can talk about the lineage of the Hittite people there. But that's another part of the migrant experience, are those who settle in another country and yet never really feel at home there and don't always jive with the customs and the peoples and the practices there. There's some yearning to go back home, some yearning to reconnect with your own people, your own customs, your own habits, and so forth. That's a really interesting part of this dynamic as well. It's a reminder to us, just as the phrases, "there were Perizzites and Canaanites in the land," those are reminders to us that these folks are living as foreigners in the place that God has promised to them. And that carries its own set of anxieties and migrant challenges. So I'm going to leave it there, and we have a lot to discuss on Wednesday, some new material I'm going to bring to you, but also just kind of going back over this part of the story and looking at the Jacob and Esau dynamic. So thanks. We'll see you then. Bye.